Up here is the Otago War Memorial. Couldn't be better placed on this lonely hilltop on the Otago Peninsula with Dunedin on one side and the sea out there. But it is pretty windswept, and it's quite a climb. It was sculpted by a guy called Robert Hosey, and his younger brother Donald died aged 22 in 1917 at the Battle of Passchendaele. And I like to think that when Robert Hosey created this, he was thinking of his brother and the other young Peninsula men who died at war between 1914 and 1918. I'm on a cross-country pilgrimage.
Come on, Marco, come on.
The Anzac spirit was born on the beaches of Gallipoli, and all your wartime deeds since then have created a century of rich and fascinating history. When my walk finishes, our inspiring new community roadshow begins.
Hello, Fremantle!
Join families telling me their stories, showing off their keepsakes, sharing their memories. From battlefields to home front, welcome to my tour of duty. My orders this week are to be dispatched overseas forthwith to Dunedin in New Zealand. I'll find out about a forgotten hero.
Something like out of a boy's own comic book.
It does sound like it, yeah. And relive the pain of a conscientious objector. His whole hands were blood-stained because he was bleeding internally. Plus, there's our tour of duty with a distinctly Scottish flavour. Oh, aye. Wow, what an entrance! Thanks to its Scottish roots, Dunedin is known as the Edinburgh of the South. Like its kilted forebears, Dunedin has a proud military heritage which has always been at the heart of New Zealand's war service. A lot of great stories get told in cabs, don't they? Partly because cabbies like to spin a yarn, but also because people like to open up to them. But 18 years ago, a Wellington cab driver heard a war story that was so extraordinary, he thought it was a wind-up. But it wasn't. Can you pull up just over there, please? Cheers, mate. Thanks. That wind-up concerned one of Dunedin's most extraordinary World War I characters. To find out more, I'm stopping at the city's famous heart, the Octagon. Dave, hiya.
Hi, Tony.
You were that Wellington cab driver on that fateful day, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
Tell me what happened.
I was taking a fare in 1996 from the French embassy in Wellington, just uptown.
Yeah.
By chance, on 2IA was the story of Upham.
Charles Upham, the great war hero, yeah.
That's right, and my French customer asked for the radio to be turned up.
Yeah.
He then disputed that Upham was New Zealand's greatest war hero.
Ah, so who was New Zealand's greatest war hero?
Well, according to that French customer at the time, James Waddell.
This grainy image is one of the few pictures of James Waddell, a pint-sized warrior from Dunedin who rose through the ranks to become a colonel in the French Foreign Legion after World War I.
My first reaction, Tony, was it was utter bullshit. It sounded something like out of a boy's own comic book.
It does sound like it, yeah.
Yes, it does.
So what do you think about the fact that so few New Zealanders know about Waddell?
I'm ashamed, as a Kiwi, to be blunt, over certain institutions who don't want to know about him, but I have had great encouragement from the press. And by the way, you're the first TV channel, dare I say it, Australian, that's done anything on Waddell.
So it has become your life's work to promote the cause of James Waddell?
Dead right. I won't be personally happy until a feature film is produced on Waddell jointly with the French.
Spielberg, are you listening? Because at the moment, hardly anybody knows about him at all, do they?
I know. Even the French have forgotten him, but in fairness to the French ambassador, they are putting things right.
Well, good for them. Let's find out how many people in Dunedin have heard of James Waddell. Come on, let's try it out. Ladies and gentlemen, have you heard of a bloke called James Waddell?
No.
He was born right here in Dunedin, right? But then he went to uni in Christchurch and he did the external exams to become an officer in the British Army. And he passed. In fact, he was the first New Zealander who, on merit, became an officer in the British Army. And so, anyway, he jumped on a ship and went over to South Africa. Do his fellow officers love him? No, he is bullied by the junior officers. He is bullied because they were all posh English boys like myself, whereas he was a colonial. So they harassed him, they hectored him, they stripped him naked, they bullied him, they beat him up, but he stayed with his regiment. He ends up in India and he falls in love and he gets married to a beautiful young French girl. Mais oui, you say?
Mais oui.
There you are, yes, yes. And she persuaded him that the English army was absolutely rotten, but that the French army was much more democratic. So he joined the Foreign Legion, and he got the Croix de Guerre for bravery in Gallipoli. He didn't just get it once, he got it twice. He was injured, he fought at the Somme, he fought at Verdun, picking up more Croix de Guerre all the time. Not one more, not two more, not three more. 8 Croix de Guerre he got. And when Parisians celebrated victory in World War I, Waddell was there on the official dais as French troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. In 1950, he slipped quietly back into New Zealand and lived in relative obscurity until his death 4 years later. So he is probably the most decorated bloke in New Zealand's history. But nobody knows about him because he didn't fight for the New Zealand forces. He was fighting for you guys, the French. But don't you think it's about time that we celebrated him a bit more than we did? Shall we, after a century, give 3 cheers for James Waddell? Hip, hip.
Hooray!
Hip, hip.
Hooray!
Are you listening to this, Dave? Yes. Hip, hip.
Hooray!
You see, we're doing it, aren't we? We're putting his name in the forefront of Dunedin. Thank you very much. See you, Dave. We're doing your work for you. Bye. Sadly, not all of New Zealand's military history is brave and noble. I'm heading down the coast to Port Chalmers to dig into the darker side of going off to war. Good afternoon, can I come aboard?
Yes,
I'm heading for Quarantine Island, and it's that word quarantine that gives you a clue about this delicate military problem. In 1915, it became the holding station for all those New Zealand soldiers who'd contracted a particularly virulent form of venereal disease. VD was the scourge of Britain's armies. At one time, 5% of all soldiers suffered from it. And if you got it, you were cold-shouldered, ignored, looked down on. You had to eat separately. You were a pariah living outside society. And it was no different back home in New Zealand.
Go.
Hey, Aaron.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
Not just my first time on this island, it's yours, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes. First time any family member's been here since Grandad was here for real, yes.
And how does that make you feel?
Very strange indeed.
Bet.
Yes.
Aaron's granddad, Thomas Fox, never made it to the battlefields of World War I. He was sent home from Egypt with a so-called self-inflicted wound. This is where the guys would have stayed, isn't it?
I think so, yes.
Yes.
Still looks like a grim barracks, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Look at that.
It's a big old building, isn't it?
Isn't it just?
For several months, Thomas and his fellow VD sufferers were isolated in buildings like this one, which is now being restored. When the Otago Daily Times tried to obtain their names, it was threatened with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. Not surprisingly, his family was blissfully unaware of his shameful condition. How did you find out that your granddad had been here?
Well, that's the job I used to have in Defence Force, was looking at personnel records and helping issue medals. And I'd always warned other people that if you get a World War I file on one of your relatives, be prepared for what's in there. You never know what they got up to. And that's exactly what happened in my case. You know. We'd thought he'd contracted something like scarlet fever in Egypt and come home early, and that was the end of his war. I didn't realise that once he got to Egypt that he contracted gonorrhoea and was sent back to New Zealand under armed escort.
And it was a particularly bad kind of gonorrhea coming out of Cairo.
I believe so, yes. Very hard to treat, and they were scared that it was going to spread into the wider population, especially back in New Zealand.
It really must have been, in many ways, a brutal regime here, mustn't it? Very painful, apart from anything else.
Well, the whole idea of the treatment, I mean, what was going on in the building behind us in terms of treating the men required pouring a very unpleasant chemical into the seat of the infection, shall we say, and doing that repeatedly until all sign of the gonorrhea had disappeared. So, I mean, let's not think it was a pleasant stay with a lovely view that these guys were going through. They were still under armed guard.
Thomas was eventually cured, but his 10-month army career had come to an inglorious end.
In my grandfather's case, what was he, 23 years old, single, carefree, and when he contracted the disease, in his mind, he was on the way to Gallipoli. I mean, he was going to have a good time before he might have met his end.
Ironically, Tom's war would have been totally different if all this had happened just a year later. The Allies were so desperate for fighting men, they would have treated him and shoved him straight back on the front line. Do you feel that this story is in any way a blot on your family's name?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, look, it is old history. For me, looking back over 100 years, it's now a curiosity. I mean, to see that his war service features here on Quarantine Island, more so than the sands of Gallipoli, is fascinating.
So much of Dunedin's military history is fascinating. Forgotten heroes, family outcasts hiding dark secrets. I'm now on the trail of a man whose controversial beliefs highlighted a social divide in wartime New Zealand. The idealist I'm talking about is this rather stern-looking fellow, Archie Baxter. He was a Dunedin lad from a dirt-poor family who was forced to leave school at the age of 12. And with no great prospects, Archie was seriously considering volunteering for war. But his whole life was transformed when he went to a lecture given by a Dunedin lawyer on pacifism. Overnight, he became a pacifist and a Christian socialist. He managed to persuade 6 of his 7 brothers not to enlist when World War I came. His 7th brother was married, so didn't have to anyway. But then conscription was imposed. Now he would have to fight. Or so they thought. Waiting for me in the Kensington Army Hall Museum are 6 members of New Zealand's Army Reserve. Could be a tough crowd. Hi, guys. Right, there's this guy called Archie Baxter. He's a local man. He was a conscientious objector in World War I, and he was passed around from prison to prison, and eventually, along with 13 other conscientious objectors, he was sent to France. When they get to France, the commander says, "From now on, I'm going to break your spirit. I am going to do things to you which you cannot possibly imagine, and I won't stop until your spirit is broken." And gradually, various of this did break, but a little group of them said, "No, we're not going to have any part to play in this whatsoever." And they included Archie. Excuse me, what's your name? Wickham. Can you come over here for a minute, Wickham? Right, can you two grip him very firmly? Can you tie him up?
Absolutely.
Now, the ones who refused to give in had to undergo what was known as field punishment number 1. OK, now, can you kneel him down? And he had to stay like that for 4 hours at a time in all weathers, except there was one slight innovation that they used. Can you shove this pike between, that's it. Now, the post wasn't straight like that. It was at an angle like that. OK, now, don't hold him. That's the whole thing. Just let him dangle like that. Now, can you imagine what the pressure was like on his hands? He said afterwards that actually his whole hands were blood-stained because he was bleeding internally through all of the pressure. This bullying, torture and even starvation proved too much. Most of the conches agreed to become stretcher bearers, but Archie stayed true to his principles. The authorities finally decided the simplest solution was to declare him insane. Get him up now. We'll assume that you're recovered now. How do you feel about a bloke like that? I mean, do you think that there is any nobility there, or do you basically think that man should have been fighting?
I mean, in World War I, at a time where wars were won by manpower, for someone to say no, it's quite a significant thing to do. You know, you're basically saying to your brother-in-arms next to you that I don't want to fight with you, I don't want to help you save your life and fight for king and country. I mean, what do you reckon, boys?
We decided to join, so...
That is the big difference, isn't it? Yeah, he was a conscript.
Yeah.
It does make an enormous difference.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have the bottle to persist in the way that he did. Archie would still be a hero to his family. In 1947, his son James, a noted poet, wrote this moving tribute. There is a feud between us. I have loved you more than my own good, because you stand for country pride and gentleness, engraved in forehead lines, veins swollen on the hand. Also, behind slow speech and quiet eye, the rock of passionate integrity. And when he died, he was still a convinced pacifist. I'll see you guys. Today's moral framework makes it hard to imagine a man being so brutalised for his beliefs. Different times mean different attitudes, of course, but Baxter's extraordinary strength under such stress makes him, in my mind anyway, a great man. My journey through Dunedin's war history has taken me to the tertiary heart of this historic town, the famous Otago University. I'm meeting Darryl Tong, a maxillofacial surgeon and army reservist, who spent the last few years operating in modern-day medical theatres of war. Darryl, the reconstructive surgery work that you've been doing on young soldiers in Afghanistan, in a sense, you've been doing it on the shoulders of earlier generations of surgeons from right here, haven't you?
Absolutely. Dunedin's been the real cradle for facial reconstruction, particularly Macindoe, who's really captured the imagination of the public.
Dunedin-born Archibald Macindoe is a true New Zealand legend. His pioneering work in plastic surgery during World War II was born of his medical studies here at the uni in the 1920s.
He started here, went off to the States, he ended up in London, and it was right time in the right place.
Yeah.
He was given the civilian consultant's job for the RAF, and that really made him as a surgeon as well as a legend as well.
Macindoe's big moment came in 1940, when the Battle of Britain was raging in the skies over the UK. 1 in 6 fighter command pilots died, and those who survived often suffered disfiguring burns.
Now, these are young men in the prime of their lives, and unfortunately, due to the highly flammable nature of the aviation fuel, the primitive airplanes that were flying at the time, the injuries that they sustained were truly horrific.
Am I right in saying that the sort of treatment that they were receiving prior to him could actually make their injuries worse rather than better?
That's correct, because the standard at the time was to bathe them in tannic acid, which basically leathered them, made their skin horrible to try and treat. The innovations that Macindoe had was to start saline baths, and literally experiment on these kids.
Mackindow's radical work on 35 RAF pilots at Queen Victoria Hospital in Sussex was a breakthrough. It was far less painful for the traumatised patients, it sped up healing times and increased survival rates. Those damaged young men realised they'd become the founding members of a unique club. What was the Guinea Pig Club?
The Guinea Pig Club, according to legend, was a group of burnt airmen who had been told by Mackindow, look, I know your lives are in my hands. I don't know all the answers, but one thing I can guarantee you, I'll give it my best shot. And so the actual burnt airmen themselves said, well, we're guinea pigs of a sort, and that by legend became the Guinea Pig Club.
A rebel to his Kiwi bootstraps, Mackindow refused to officially join the RAF, realising he couldn't then be dictated to by Air Force brass. He was free to concentrate on the most important people.
Because of his civilian contacts, he could bypass the military, all for his patients. Not so much for him, but all for his unit and for his patients.
He let them have booze, didn't he?
Very much so. At the end of the ward, Ward 3, would be a barrel of beer. That's great stuff.
I find it quite inspiring that not only was he working on their physical condition, but he recognised that psychologically they would have been profoundly damaged by the look of their injuries and wanted to help them with that as well.
Very much so. When they were casualties, they weren't actually allowed to wear their own uniform, and he battled the authorities and say, look, they're still serving personnel. They should, by right, be wearing their uniform with pride and also still receive their salary as well. And then he went to East Grinstead, the town that never stared.
The town that never stares is a gorgeous phrase. What does it mean?
Well, East Grinstead is a small village attached to the hospital where Mackindow worked. And he told them, point blank, these people will have horrific injuries, but you must look beyond that and see them as the bright young men that they really are. And that lovely phrase, the town that never stared, came out of their own people.
Archie Mackindow was knighted in 1947, but his brilliant career was cut short 13 years later when he died aged just 59. The Guinea Pig Club had lost its beloved founder. What is it that really appeals to you about Mackindow so much?
His humanity. It was his humanity that counted, and that's what he is really remembered for.
There's another Dunedin-born fella who wrote his name large in New Zealand's World War II annals. To tell his story, I need to cross this beautiful city to one of its most famous landmarks, the magnificent Dunedin railway station, the setting for so many farewells to soldiers going off to war. Now, just look at this building. Isn't it fantastic? It's a ticket hall, of course, and it was built in 1903. And I know this is virtually empty now, but imagine what it would have been like during World War I and World War II. Lots and lots of young men in uniform steaming out to the trains, and anxious, tearful mothers looking at them go and wondering whether they'd end up dead in the mud of Flanders or come back as heroes covered in medals. One man who did come back a national hero was Dunedin-born Clive Hulme. He became legendary for his part in the Battle of Crete in World War II. Allied-held Crete was the key to the Eastern Mediterranean. On May 20, 1941, the Germans launched a massive assault using a tactic never before seen in modern warfare. They dropped wave after wave of commandos by parachute, and that's what the Allies were having to deal with. So the battle lasted well over a week, and for the first 2 days, Clive led parties of men to attack the newly established German front line, even though they were under attack from mortars and heavy weapons and machine guns, and they started to take out the snipers who were attacking them. At the end of the second day, there are 131 dead in Clive's part of the battle. Many of them had been actually killed by Clive himself, and even after the rest of his men moved on, Clive stayed behind with just 2 other guys, continuing to take out snipers. But even though they were having successes like this, by and large, the Allies were on the retreat, and round about that time, Clive heard that his brother had just been killed, so you can imagine how that made him feel. Nevertheless, he played such a major part in the Allies' retreat. For instance, there was a mortar party of 4 Germans. Single-handedly, Clive took all 4 of them out. There were snipers, 5 of them, over in another direction. He took 1, 2, 3, all 5 he shot. By the end of the battle, which lasted for well over a week, he'd hardly had any sleep. He must have been exhausted, must have been mourning his brother too. He had shot 33 snipers. An extraordinary example of sustained heroism under fire. Clive Hull's actions during the 11-day battle earned him the ultimate accolade for bravery, the Victoria Cross. Ron, people might think that I was exaggerating for dramatic effect when I was telling that story, but I got it all from the official citation.
I don't know if the official citation told the whole story, or if it even could tell the whole story in such a fluid battle. I suspect that to come up with a precise number of 33 snipers that he killed is probably a conservative guess.
Conservative?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think so. Given, that he was in action over several days. He's certainly an extraordinary bloke, but I think he's got to be seen in the context of his time. He was a labourer, brought up during the Depression in New Zealand. So there was a lot of rural men at the time who thought nothing of going out shooting rabbits and shooting other game for food. So what he did on Crete came, I guess you could say, naturally to him, unlike today, where it wouldn't come naturally.
Yeah, but it is more than just that. It's like wholesale carnage. There's a bit of a psychopathic element to all that, isn't there?
I wouldn't describe him as a psychopath. Certainly dedicated to the task he was given, dedicated to shooting Germans so that he could protect his own men and himself.
But in recent years, Hull's actions on Crete have been called into question. Historians claim that during his extraordinary killing spree, he actually donned a German paratrooper's camouflage outfit in order to get closer to the enemy. Wasn't that against the whole diktat of the way that war ought to be conducted?
Well, yes, it is. Of course it is. But it's all very well to argue, things in the abstract about a war, but the fact is war is mortal conflict, and one person or the other is going to die. And to stop yourself from dying, you've got to kill the other bloke.
Was Clive's alleged subterfuge wrong? I don't know. I've never been in a war. People make rules, of course, but it's one thing to fight a theoretical war. Clive Hull was fighting a real war. While Clive was flying the flag for New Zealanders overseas, the good citizens of Dunedin were doing their bit on the home front. Well, most of them anyway. During the Second World War, the troops overseas needed their morale boosting with things like socks and sweets and tobacco and radios, not to mention parcels for the prisoners of war. And the people who provided all that were, of course, the Red Cross. And every town in New Zealand was given the job of raising money for them. So how did the good people of Dunedin go about the task? They set up this slap bang in the middle of town. A pretend air raid shelter. That's a good piece of PR, isn't it? That would bring the dollars in. Well, no, actually it didn't, because the local shopkeepers didn't like it. They said that it would put off potential customers, which is a bit mean, really. And indeed, that was reflected in the figures from the newspapers, which said that as far as raising money for the Red Cross was concerned, Wellington was first, then Auckland, then Christchurch, and Dunedin was a miserly fourth. Hunting down war history in Dunedin requires stiff resolve and enough aerobic capacity to negotiate the fair city's substantial inclines. I'm on my way to the boyhood home of a bloke who forged his reputation in World War II. His name was Peter McIntyre. As New Zealand's official war artist, he was armed with a paintbrush, not a gun.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, I'm Tony Robinson.
Not today, thank you.
Oh, please let me come in.
Welcome to Gilmore Street.
Thank you very much.
Come in.
The house is now home to McIntyre's two nieces, Heather and Mary, who have vivid and, well, rather contemporary memories of him.
Well, in the parlance of today, he was cool. He was a cool uncle.
In what way?
Well, he tolerated two small nieces with great good humour. I can remember being taken as a very small girl to visit his current lady love and coming home with two white mice. Now, you can't do better than that as an uncle.
This cool uncle with the movie star looks studied in London, and when World War II broke out, Peter McIntyre enlisted as a gunner in the 34th Tank Battery. 2 years later, Major General Bernard Freyberg personally appointed him official war artist with the rank of captain. I wonder how he felt when he was doing these paintings, surrounded by the hurly-burly of war. It must have been very hard to do that kind of painting.
Indeed, indeed.
I think he said at one time it wasn't much fun sitting in a foxhole sketching with a complete battle raging all round, and what he had was a tin hat.
People must have been surprised to see him painting.
Well, of course they were, and particularly on Crete, when the onslaught of the German air assault happened, and here he is sitting in a foxhole with parachutes descending, sensible men hurtling past to safety or comparative safety, and Peter sketching, and one man doing a double take with disbelief and saying, "You must be mad." But in fact, there was a great core of fear there, but he continued to make that record. Yeah. That was the important thing.
Do you think any of the other soldiers were a bit contemptuous that he was a painter and not a fighter?
Oh, of course they did, yes. His painting, to them, wasn't active service. So there were some derogatory remarks, such as a bit of a ponce.
From Crete to the Western Desert to Italy, McIntyre's works took the brutality and ugliness of war and turned them into an art form.
They had a beauty to them. They told a record. They had a beauty in the midst of horror, which took skill to show. And it was always extremely gratifying for somebody to say, "Oh, you're Peter McIntyre's niece." Marvellous.
What did he feel about the war, do you think?
He saw things that no one should ever see. He was a deep thinker, and I think there were moments of great hurt.
No men came back unscathed. They couldn't, could they? I don't think so.
But the serious war artist had a lighter, more comical side to his art and personality. I love this
marvellous
picture here.
Yes.
It's wonderful what leaks out. Keep your mouth shut.
Yes.
What did you two think when you saw that?
Oh, tee-hee-hee.
Hilarious.
We were at that age, you know, giggling. I thought it was delightful.
Like so many war artists, McIntyre's work defined the soldier's experience in World War II. He was exhibited across Europe and became a household name in his homeland. Peter McIntyre OBE died in 1995. But I'm pleased to say his legacy, and I suspect his spirit, lives on in his two delightful nieces. I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed talking to you. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
Can we reciprocate,
You can.
as Lasky said? Yes, it's been a pleasure for us too.
Thank you both very much.
Well, we were talking about a very special person.
Lovely to
Yes.
meet you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. As with lots of the famous Dunedin men I've found out about on my walk, Peter McIntyre went to Otago Boys High. This famous school will play host to tomorrow's very special roadshow. Bring it on, I say. Wow, what an entrance! Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. And thank you for sharing with me your fantastic city over the past week. I've never been here before, and we were all completely blown away by it. And all the great stories that you told us about the First and Second World Wars, and very inspiring. And thank you too to the boys' school for inviting us here today. Really appropriate that we should be at this school, because so many of the stories we were confronted by during the past week involved young men who had been educated here. I'm thinking of people like Archie Mackindoe, the plastic surgery pioneer. I'm thinking of Peter McIntyre, the famous Second World War artist, whose nieces I can see here, Heather and Mary, who really won our hearts over the last couple of days when they were talking to us about the kinds of sacrifices that young Dunedin men made in the First and Second World War. And I know there's loads more stories to come, and I know that lots of you have brought memorabilia with you, which we're delighted that you did. There will be historians and specialists dotted around here all day. Please don't be inhibited. Go and have a chat with them whenever you want, and I'll stop wittering on now, and let's get on with the Tour of Duty Roadshow. Hiya. Thank you for coming again. Good to see you. High five. High five. Hello.
Hello, Tony.
He looks smart, doesn't he? What's going on here, then?
Well, this is a bandolier.
Yeah.
Something like this my father would have been wearing at Passchendaele.
And what was a bandolier for?
It held the bullets, about 150 rounds.
Yeah.
And at Passchendaele, he was in the mud up to his knees or higher, and a German bullet hit his bullet, and it exploded. So my father wasn't killed, but he was severely injured.
So he would have died if it hadn't been for the bullet,
Absolutely.
although it was... Is that it?
That's it.
And that's him?
That's my father.
Private Harry
Robertson.
Did he survive the war?
Oh, yes, he did. I wouldn't be here if he hadn't have.
Oh, that's true, yeah. That's a pretty silly question, really, isn't it?
You want to start again?
Yeah, no. Can you stay there for one moment? We've got our own historians here. Damien, can I borrow you just for a minute? Damien's at Massey University, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, this gentleman is talking about Passchendaele. So many of the stories that I've heard over the course of the week about young men from Dunedin have been about Passchendaele. What was the significance of it for New Zealanders?
In a nutshell, Passchendaele is the bloodiest day in the history of the New Zealand Army. You know, the British have the 1st of July on the Somme. For the New Zealanders, it's 12th of October 1917 at Passchendaele.
More people lost than at Gallipoli?
Absolutely, yeah. The New Zealand division loses 3,700 men, 800 of whom are killed. And the attack is an absolute complete failure, an absolute debacle. It's the classic, I mean, when people sort of mention the word World War I, people think of mud, blood and trenches. This is it. This is the cliche come to life. That's the 12th of October in a nutshell. And the New Zealanders came in right at the end to the final phase of the offensive at Passchendaele. Failed to take it, and then the Canadians came in 2 weeks later, and they spent another 3 weeks fighting there, and it finally fell in November 1917.
So in a way, your dad was really lucky, wasn't he? He may have had that terrible injury, but at least that meant he didn't have to continue with the fighting at Passchendaele.
Well, he was lucky in that so many soldiers were wounded, but drowned in the mud before they could be rescued. So he was very lucky to be picked up and taken back and be treated.
That's a lovely story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi there.
This looks very interesting. What's all this about?
Well, my father was at Gallipoli and he couldn't find any paper, so he wrote to his sister on that piece of wood.
And this is your father?
That's him, yes.
Don't you look like him?
Do you think?
Oh, extraordinarily so.
I'm older now than he was when he died.
Isn't this intriguing? It says, "My dear Con, paper scarcer than ever." Well, yes, it certainly
right,
was,
yeah.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Received newspapers, but no letters lately. Paper appreciated very much. Receiving very little news of what's going on. I'm keeping in splendid health. Now, it says AFFEC, presumably that's from your affectionate brother.
That'll be right, yes.
Yeah, he's run out of space, hasn't he?
Yes, he has, really. Okay.
Have you seen this? It's a postcard, a genuine postcard, but made out of wood because they'd run out of paper.
Oh, how lovely.
And just shoved it in the letterbox.
If you look on the other side of it, you'll find the address.
Oh, like a postcard.
Yeah.
How extraordinary.
It is, really. Yeah.
What's OAS?
On active service.
On active service, so you didn't have to pay for the postage.
That's right, yes. You could try it.
What a lovely thing, thank you. I've never seen anything like that before. Thank you. New Zealand's rich tapestry of war history is rolling out today in the charming city of Dunedin. We're high up on the hill at Otago Boys High School, and we're all learning about just one subject. This way, ladies and gentlemen. Through here. Bev, I've got you a crowd. Over here, this is one of my favourite stories. Do gather around and listen to it. It's one of my favourite stories because apart from anything else, it's about this school. And your uncle, Bev?
This is hallowed ground. This is where he went to school, where my father went to school.
And what was your uncle's name?
Swatty Aiken.
Swatty Aiken. And that was a nickname, presumably.
That's a nickname.
Yeah. And what kind of guy was he?
Very quiet, probably a very mild-mannered man, but the most intelligent man with a photographic memory and total recall. Everything he could calculate in a matter of seconds.
Did he impress the boys with it?
Absolutely impressed a lot of people with it.
Now, this is the story, not about him at the school, but when he was called up.
Yes.
And this musical instrument. How did he get hold of this?
That was won in a raffle.
A raffle? Where was the raffle?
On board the ship, heading to overseas to the First World War, and the person that won it obviously couldn't play it, and he could. So they sort of tossed him, you might as well have it, you play the violin.
And so he held on to it. But you weren't actually allowed to carry musical instruments around, were you?
Well, you weren't allowed personal items like that with you. And this isn't a little box or trinket or anything. This is a violin in a case. But he did.
So where did he go with it?
He went to Gallipoli and everything with it.
But he didn't just carry it around. He would actually play it to the men, wouldn't he?
He played it.
What sort of things did he play?
Their favourite was humoresque.
Humoresque.
And the thought of him playing that after they'd come in from being in the trenches on the front line all day and they're exhausted. That, to me, is just so poignant. To think of that music drifting over the front.
There must have been so many men who survived the war for whom the music from that violin would have been a central experience to their lives then. That's a lovely story, isn't it? Tell us his name again.
Swatty Aiken.
Swatty Aiken. Taught in these very buildings. Swatty, here's your violin. It's still here. You got it? I'm not really supposed to be doing this. I'm supposed to be talking to you about history. This lovely lady is called Pat. Hi, Pat. Come round and have a look at these curious objects. What is that, Pat?
Now, this is my father's pay book in the First World War, and it was found in the old Reed building in Dunedin amongst a whole lot of rubbish, and this was just before Christmas.
Just this Christmas?
Yes. It's so interesting because I see he was paid 2 and 6 a day in the army.
That was actually quite a lot, wasn't it, for those times? It was more than the British soldiers were getting. I think we got about $1 a day.
Yes.
And you got 2 and 6?
Yes.
Flipping colonials.
And...
and this is him? This is your father?
Yes, that's my father, yes. And...
Very handsome.
Yes.
They're all saying he was very handsome.
We still don't know how my father's pay book got into that old building in Dunedin, because he was farming out of Dunedin.
So this is a mystery?
Yes, it's quite a mystery.
What was this doing in this building?
We have no idea, and we were so lucky that a young boy who just started work there hadn't thrown it out with all the other rubbish that was in the box.
It still rankles that he got ½ a crown a day and my granddad only got $1. Needed to wear gloves for this, don't we?
Yeah, museum objects, mate.
I thought this was a napkin ring. Why have you brought a napkin ring? But it's not that at all, is it?
No, it's not. It's a little band from a set of bagpipes, one of 8, that was presented to the main body men who gathered in Dunedin in late 1914 before they went off to war, full of excitement, full of enthusiasm for the great adventure. And the local Scottish societies thought they'd have to send Dunedin blokes away with bagpipes. So here they are, 8 sets of bagpipes, proudly tucked under their arms, and off they went.
Just like earlier on today when I first arrived. See how appropriate that was?
Except for the fact that once they actually landed in Gallipoli, this set of bagpipes must have been played. A Canadian officer came below later and found them on the ground on the sand, smashed to pieces and drenched in blood. He removed the little band there to be a curio, and later in the war he met someone from Dunedin. He said, "Here, take this back to Dunedin where it came from. That's where it belongs." And so we look after that at the museum, you know, as a reminder of this great enthusiasm and the harsh reality that they faced up to at Gallipoli.
It says, from the expeditionary force in the European war. It's from the days when no one knew there was going to be another one. So it could well have been the bagpipe from
one of those chaps.
One of those guys.
I wish we knew which one.
Well, excuse me, that has been the most fantastic afternoon. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure sharing all the finds and artifacts with you. I loved seeing Swatty Aitken's violin, which he took all the way around Gallipoli and France, and the silver band from the bloodstained bagpipes at Anzac Cove. Thank you for sharing them with us, and I think the most appropriate way of saying goodbye is for us to revisit one of the school's great traditions, the reading of the list of those young men who fell during the First World War, who previously had been school students here. And Head Prefect Michael Williams is going to read the list out to us. Thank you, Michael.
Hamilton, James Alistair. Haraway, Norman Charles. Harris, James Fulton Neal. Henderson, Colin Selkirk. Henderson, Hugh William. Henderson, Matthew R. Hendra, Thomas Henry. Henry, Ernest Ralph Cook. Hay, Ronald John Wilson. Finn, Hugh William. Jupp, Gordon Archibald. Kelly, Alan Cameron.
In the Second World War, a lot of Australians who were too old to fight joined the Volunteer Defence Corps. And there was one such bloke here in Fremantle, whose name I won't give away for reasons that will become obvious in a second. Anyway, he was patrolling late one night when, in the darkness, he saw a figure looming up, and he drew his rifle and said, "Who goes there?" And there was silence. "Who goes there?" He said again. Still silence. "If you do not tell me who goes there, I will fire this rifle." Yet again, silence. As the smoke cleared, he saw what he'd done. He had shot a postbox. I wonder what was redder, his cheeks or the postbox? Modern-day Fremantle is a bustling, seaside, chilled-out, sit-around and relax sort of town. But when world wars took young Australian men and women overseas, many of them would have watched this part of their homeland disappear over the horizon as their ships took them off to fight. In those simple times, many of those young men and women took up pen and paper and committed the sights and sounds, the fears and the emotions to their diaries. Diaries which record war in a way that history books never can. And it's one of those diaries that's brought me to the Western Australian Maritime Museum, or to be exact, its dry dock. Look at this glorious ship, isn't she fantastic? This is HMAS Ovens, named after Lieutenant Ovens, who surveyed a lot of New South Wales in the early 19th century. She's an Oberon class, commissioned in 1969, a silent-running patrol sub, which could stay at sea for months at a time. What a great piece of technology. Let's have a look inside, shall we? "90 metres long with 63 crew, 14 torpedoes and every bit of space used for something. Even for a little guy like me, it's claustrophobic." This is the real nerve centre of the submarine. There is where they control the torpedoes. You've got the sonar over there. This is where the driver, the plainsman, sits. And down here, there's all the stuff that controls the ballast. The whole place is brimful of late 1960s electronics. How different from the technology available in the very first Australian submarines in the beginning of the First World War. In 1911, the newly formed Royal Australian Navy was a mini-me of its British big brother. So when we got subs, you Aussies got subs, AE1 and AE2. When World War I broke out, the two subs patrolled the waters north of Australia for German raiders. On September the 14th, 1914, AE1 was off the coast of New Britain when she mysteriously disappeared, along with her crew of 35. To this day, she's never been found. As you can imagine, the crew of AE2 were absolutely gutted. In fact, there was a bloke on board, a Fremantle man called Charles Suckling, who wrote a diary about his time in the submarine, and this is what he wrote about the loss of AE1. "Not a trace or sign of the ill-fated submarine was found. To us, their companions and jesting rivals over many a mile of sea, we were losing, in many cases, friends of long years' standing. Our loss was a loss indeed." 7 months later, as the first Anzacs stormed ashore at Gallipoli, AE2 was right there, threading her way through the treacherous Dardanelles Strait. No boat had ever succeeded in this suicidal task, but for 5 days, she created mayhem among enemy troop transports and fishing boats. Eventually, she encountered a Turkish ship, and in order to avoid being blown up, she dived beyond her safety limit of 30 metres. But then, of course, she was in danger, so she came back up again. And when she did, the Turkish ship fired at her and blew up her engine room. Her fate was sealed. They were going to have to sink her, and the captain would be the last man off. Charles Suckling wrote, "The valves in the boat had been opened, and she was slowly flooding. All had left the boat except the captain. He was standing on the stern waiting for her to sink, which she soon did, slowly and gracefully, without sound or sigh, without causing an eddy or ripple on the water. AE2 just slid away on her last and longest dive into 65 fathoms of water." Despite the loss, her landmark mission was rated a huge success, which would have been some comfort for the crew of the AE2, who were picked up and sat out the rest of the war in a grim Turkish POW camp. Then began a life for us which was nothing but a sorry existence. And I don't think, if we had known what was ahead of us, that one of us would have left the boat. When it was over, Charles returned to Fremantle and eventually died here, aged 92, the last of the AE2 crew. Time for me to leave the treacherous waters of the Dardanelles and delve into the legal minefield that is commercial branding. What does that have to do with war? Let me grab a cuppa and a snack, and I'll tell you. Hiya.
Hi, how are we going?
OK, can I have a skinny cappuccino, please?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks a lot. Excuse me, have you got room for one here?
Yes.
It's so crowded, isn't it?
Yes, it is a bit.
Thank you very much. Are those what I think they are?
Yes, Tony, they're Anzac biscuits.
It's funny for me as an Englishman, the word Anzac really hardly means anything at all.
Ditto.
You're English too?
Yes.
But for Australians and New Zealanders, it's such an important word, isn't it? Really
yes. Yeah.
iconic. It sort of represents all that heroism and mateship that Australians value so much.
Yes.
Do you know that right from the start that was true? I've got somewhere, if I can find it, I've got a quote from Billy Hughes, who was the Australian Prime Minister. And he said, "Into a world saturated by material things, which has made wealth the standard of greatness, comes the sweet, purifying breath of self-sacrifice. Soldiers, your names will be handed down in your own native land and be as household words." Well, he was kind of right, but he was also kind of wrong. Anzac did become a household word, but it certainly wasn't purified and unsullied. Within months of Gallipoli, everyone wanted a piece of the Anzac action. My favourite is the wildly inappropriate, politically incorrect Anzac Gollywog Company, featuring a dog called Anzac. Understandably, the government decided that this was too offensive and they were going to stop people making money off the word Anzac. So what they said is, we'll have this regulation, which means you're only allowed to call your product Anzac if you've asked permission, and we've granted it. There was, though, one exception, which is what made me think about Anzac Day when I saw those biscuits, and it was the biscuits. I think the government thought, can I pinch one? Sorry. This is just as a demonstration. He paid for them. The government said that Anzac biscuits had been such a common way of raising money for good works, for charities, the Red Cross, for injured soldiers, that it wouldn't be fair not to allow people to market Anzac biscuits. So, provided they used the proper recipe, they could call them Anzac biscuits.
Yeah.
But there was one thing you couldn't do. You couldn't sell Anzac cookies, because the word cookie was American. Absolutely.
Yes, that's
That wouldn't go
right.
in it.
Yes.
I prefer this to my croissant. Do you want to swap?
No, I'll stay with Anzac.
I've come out into the suburbs of Fremantle looking for the story of an ordinary man who never considered himself particularly special, never thought he'd done anything that remarkable. And you must be thinking, well, why are we listening to this story then? Sounds really boring. But bear with me, because when he was in his 70s, people started saying to him, Claude, you have lived an extraordinary life. And that reaction was sparked by his grandson. His name is Lindsay Powell, and one look inside this ramshackle studio in the backyard of his house tells you everything you need to know about him. He's an artist, and it's this haunting image that made his grandfather such an unlikely celebrity. There he is again. That is such a great image, isn't it? Lindsay? Lindsay?
Yes, Tony.
That is your grandfather, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Claude Schulz?
Claude Schulz.
But this is in the UK before he came out to Australia.
Yes, that's when he joined the Mercury, the training ship.
Claude Schulz was just 14 when he signed on with the Royal Navy in 1916. What I find so intriguing about that is he's in a man's uniform, but he's got the face of a frightened boy, hasn't he?
He wrote back to his father soon after he went into the training ship saying, "Can I come home now?"
And what does his dad say?
No, you've made your bed, so you've got to put up with it.
In 1918, 17-year-old Claude was there when the British Grand Fleet escorted the defeated German High Seas Fleet to Scapa Flow in Scotland. And like the rest of the Grand Fleet, he wasn't there as the Germans scuttled 2/3 of the fleet when the Brits weren't looking. Oops. Yeah, the German sailors pulled the plug and the British were incandescent with rage.
Well, that's right. And he was a young boy in the Navy still at that point and witnessed that.
But then scroll forward 20 years and here he is in the Second World War.
That's right. He's the chief torpedo officer. When the war happened, one of his jobs was to blow up Fremantle Harbour if the Japanese took over. So he had his explosives in the tunnel underneath the roundhouse and he was to deploy them to blow it up.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because he's still an ordinary bloke, but he does have a very senior job in Fremantle.
That's right. He did have, yes, a senior job and a very responsible one too. I mean, you wouldn't want to blow it up at the wrong point in time.
Certainly not. When his Navy days were done, Claude might well have lived out his life in quiet retirement. But two things changed him forever. In 1976, Lindsay's haunting image of 14-year-old Claude captivated the nation. Then, in 2009, the sprightly 108-year-old achieved a historic milestone. His real celebrity was that he was the last known surviving combatant from World War I, wasn't it?
That's right. As Claude got older, the image became more iconic.
Was he proud of your work?
Yes, he was proud of my work, and they had some of my paintings hanging in their house.
It must be great for you, not only to have created this national icon, but the icon itself was someone who you love so much.
That's right, and the icon came from the picture, and it was built by his longevity.
When Claude Schulz died in 2011, aged 110, the World War I icon's life was celebrated with an honour guard and a 12-gun salute. But I prefer to remember him for this line from his memoirs. Old men make the decisions that send the young men into war. If it was the other way around, and the old pollies were off fighting, then there would never be any wars. My tour of duty has taken me out west to Fremantle. This port city has more than its fair share of war history. And of course it was home to Claude Schulz, an icon of World War I. During World War II, he was sent up north to the seaside town of Broome. But this was no pleasure trip. His task was to deal with the aftermath of Western Australia's darkest day of the Second World War. On the 3rd of March 1942, the town of Broome was jam-packed full of planes. On the airstrip there were bombers, flying fortresses, liberators, and there were 15 seaplanes on Roebuck Bay. At 9:30 a.m, 9 Mitsubishi fighters flew in and strafed the entire place. There was virtually no resistance, and every operational plane was destroyed. Out in Roebuck Bay, all of the seaplanes were sinking. There were civilians on board, but they couldn't swim away because virtually the entire bay was covered in blazing aircraft fuel. It was carnage. Like the bombing of Sydney and Newcastle in the same year, this attack was primarily to undermine Australian morale. Tragically, many of the people on the seaplanes were women and children. Mac, why were there so many planes in Broome that day?
Oh, there was an evacuation of people from Java ahead of a known Japanese invasion. And apparently a lot of them were families of Dutch service folk and so on. And they're being got out of Java as quickly as they can because war has been declared.
Why were there so many people still in the planes? I would have thought that they would have wanted to get on land.
A number of issues there, really. You've got, first of all, pilots who really are at the end of their tether in terms of hours, having done many, many flights. They have to sleep, and you have tide. Broome tides are very changeable, and you need to get your tides right to get off, wind and all that. So your people are waiting for the pilots to rest, planes to be refueled, tides to be right, and they're on board waiting for them to come back on the planes, take off that morning at 9:30. They're just waiting for their pilots, Tony.
To this day, the exact number of deaths in the Broome raid is unknown. It's thought to be about 88, but many of the unlisted refugees' bodies may have been lost in the ocean. It was such a horrendous episode that I don't understand why we don't know more about it.
Well, West Australians know about it. We call it our Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, but Darwin calls Darwin the Pearl Harbor, and Sydney.
Yeah. But whatever happens over here never crosses a nullarbor. These stories don't get over there until someone like yourself tells them over there.
Four months earlier, in November 1941, this part of the country had been thrust into the limelight when the pride of the Royal Australian Navy, HMAS Sydney, was lost with all 645 crew off the Western Australian coast. In the face of Australia's worst naval disaster and then the Darwin bombing, is it possible that the fate of those poor souls killed at Broome simply got swept aside by a shell-shocked public? It's a pretty heroic-looking statue, isn't it? That's the kind of statue people actually look at. It's Hughie Edwards, Sir Hughie Edwards, one of the great sons of Fremantle, had a string of letters after his name, including the VC, the Victoria Cross. He was a humble blacksmith's son who doggedly worked his way up from menial labourer to private in the Australian Army to pilot with the RAAF. When he joined an RAF bomber squadron in Britain, Hughie Edwards was on his way to becoming a celebrated war hero. Very, very brave, but not very good at flying. At least the flying was all right. It was actually the landing that he was rubbish at. He once said that he didn't like landing the heavy bombers, and if there was anyone else around who would land them for him, he would be only too relieved. He flew one plane up into the sky, it froze and spun right down to the ground again and crashed. Another one, he got lost, missed the airstrip, crashed that one too. A third one, he crashed when it was full of bombs. But his moment of glory came in 1941 when he was asked to lead the bomb attack on Bremen, which was one of the most defended cities in Germany at the time. Because it was going to have to be in daylight, that meant flying very low. And one thing he was good at was this low flying. He was about 50 foot from the ground, that's all, and he was dodging cables and telegraph wires and barrage balloons. Lost 4 planes, but the rest of them dumped their bombs on Bremen and they got back to England without any further loss. And all in all, he flew 75 missions, and his last crash was in 1953, when he flew into a chimney. Well done, mate. Huey's not the only Fremantleite, is that the right word, to be publicly immortalised here. This rather gorgeous piece of street art on the wall of the Norfolk Hotel is an image of Dorothy Tangney. In 1943, Dorothy was the first woman elected to the Federal Senate. It was the perfect forum to champion a cause dear to her heart: the darker side of Australia's war brides. Once again, I'm off to the pub for a drink and a yarn. Ken, is yours.
Thanks, Tony.
Madison.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Madison, what exactly was a war bride?
A war bride was a woman who married a foreign serviceman during the war. So in an Australian context, women during World War II married Dutch, British and New Zealand servicemen, but in the highest number they married American servicemen.
Well, that sounds pretty great to me. I mean, a lot of Australian women would have been very poor during and after the war, whereas a lot of the Americans would have been pretty wealthy. Presumably there were lots of happy endings.
Not necessarily. They were certainly attractive to Australian women because they had access to luxury goods in a time of rationing. They were very well dressed, they were charming and they were foreign, but not all the engagements and relationships were happy ending.
In some cases, devoted husbands shipped out to new theatres of war, never to return. The less gallant simply shipped out, returning to the States to resume old lives or start new ones. Their abandoned brides, many now mothers, could only apply for divorce in the US.
So Dorothy Tangney campaigned for those women to be allowed to file for divorce in an Australian court and also be recognised here for the purposes of social services benefits as war widows.
One of those single mum war widows was this woman, Gloria Constantine. On Mother's Day in 1943, she gave birth to a little boy she called Ken. Ladies and gentlemen, you know that fantastic mural outside the pub? Do you all know who it's of?
Yes.
Come on then, who is it?
Senator Dorothy Tangney.
Absolutely right. And Ken has a very interesting story to tell about the issue of war brides. Are you happy to share it with the people in the pub?
Yeah, sure, Tony. I'm the product of a war bride. My father was an American Army serviceman who was stationed in Fremantle. And he and my mother met. They got married. I was conceived. Just before I was born, he went to the Philippines, and in the Philippines, he was shot in the head. The bullet went between his temple and his helmet and cut the nerves on his cheek. So his mouth was hanging open like this, but he still fought to the end of the battle. When the battle was over, he was then sent, because of his injury, to Texas. And at that time, my mother and I were living with my grandparents.
But he did write to your mum and sent her money, didn't he?
Yes, he was writing to Mum and sending her money. From what we can establish later, my grandmother was getting the letters, opening them, taking the money, using that to support her gambling addiction, and never, ever showed my mother the letters. So a couple of years go by. My mother had not heard from my father. My father had not heard from my mother, even though he'd been writing. So he thought she had given him up and then he applied for a divorce in Texas.
But you did some research, after which there was a happy reunion.
Yes, there was. We actually rediscovered each other. I found that even at that late stage, my father was still alive and my mother was still alive. We managed to get them together on her 80th birthday. And it was basically like they had never been apart. There was hugging and tears and giggling like two teenagers. You know, it was almost embarrassing to watch. And I was 57 years old when I first shook my father's hand. So it was good that we all got together at the end. We found out what had happened, where things had gone wrong. But they're very fortunate. He married a wonderful woman the second time. My mother married a wonderful man the second time.
Oh, isn't that lovely? That was great, wasn't it? Well done, Ken. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your help. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. One of the things I enjoyed so much about the last few minutes was that even though she died about 30 years ago, everyone knew who Dorothy Tangney was. I hope when I die, they put my picture outside a pub. See ya. Like so much of Australia in World War II, the oversexed, overpaid and overhere American GIs invaded Fremantle. I wonder if one of their barracks said something about the city's reaction to them. This lovely old building was originally Fremantle's lunatic asylum, but in the Second World War, it became a base for US submarine activities. Over 200 service... I'm feeling completely upstaged by this music. This is rather nice, isn't it? Alleluia, 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 alleluia. Hey! That was so nice. Excuse me, can I say this? You remind me of the story of the Vienna Boys Choir. Do you know about them? No. They were created in about 1500 for the pleasure of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. And in the late 1930s, their choir master, Dr. Georg Gruber, he decided to pull 20 of them to one side and create a new touring version. And he would call them the Vienna Mozart Boys Choir, which he wanted to take on a world tour. For almost a year, these Nightingales of Vienna toured North America, across the Pacific to New Zealand and Australia. As they sang their last concert in Fremantle, the world was about to be plunged into darkness. The date was the 2nd of September, 1939. The next morning, they all go down to Freo to get on the boat to go back. What happens? War is declared, and immediately all the merchant vessels are requisitioned for the war effort. So these guys are completely stuck. One moment they're international stars, and the next minute they're potential internees. But eventually, the Archbishop of Melbourne, whose name was Daniel Mannix, took them all, lock, stock and barrel, and rebranded them as the St Patrick's Cathedral Choir, gave them all into Catholic families to look after, and their choirmaster, Dr. Georg Gruber, remained their choirmaster until 1941, when suddenly he was arrested. Very good. for Nazi sympathies. Authorities claimed the choir's beloved leader was the musical mastermind behind a Nazi plot to brainwash young German children. It was off to the nick for him until 1947, when he was deported to Europe. The choir hadn't seen him for all this time that he's been in prison. But they've stayed loyal to him because he was like a father figure to them. I can see, look at that face, he's like a father figure to them. And so they all went down to the docks in Port Melbourne, and they weren't allowed to say goodbye, and they weren't allowed to get anywhere near him. And they all waved him off. Waved poor Georg off. That's all right.
Eventually, Gruber was cleared of all charges and returned to his old life. Ironically, most of the boys didn't. After 5 years in virtual captivity on the other side of the world, just one of them went home. The rest stayed in Australia, and some waited many years before being reunited with their families.
After the war was over, someone said to them, weren't you upset that you weren't allowed to go back home earlier? And one of the boys said, no, if we'd gone home, I might have got an Iron Cross, but I would probably have ended up with a wooden cross. So at least their lives were saved, weren't they? And they stayed in Australia. And that's the end of the story. Anyway, nice to meet you. Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry to have interrupted you all. I was supposed to be doing something entirely different out there. See ya. Bye. Well, that was an interesting little diversion, wasn't it? I was supposed to be telling you about the US submarine base that was stationed here during the war. But I don't think I'll bother. Let's go to the roadshow instead.
Something tells me this will be a big one. I know Fremantle's been desperate for something like our roadshow to celebrate its proud military history, because all week I've been hearing whispers about special guests, surprising mementos, and never-before-seen family treasures going back 100 years. We found the perfect location, and it looks like a big crowd has found us. So it's full steam ahead, and damn the torpedoes.
Welcome to the Western Australia Military Museum here in Fremantle, where the guys have been absolutely fantastic. This is where we're having our roadshow. They've got a lot of period vehicles for us, including one for me to make my grand entrance. Lots of memorabilia, lots of stories. Only one problem. As you can see, it looks like we're going to have a crowd of around about 1,000 people today, and we've only got about 250 sausages to sizzle. So if you wouldn't mind bearing with us for about 5 minutes, I'll sort everything out, and then we'll start the roadshow. Hi, nice to see you. Morning.
Everybody come in now, please.
To see you all again. The contribution that Fremantle, Perth, Western Australia has made to Australia's war effort over the last 100 years or so has been absolutely spectacular. There are so many stories here in the museum. There are the stories that you've got, there's the memorabilia that you've got. I hope that you'll be sharing a lot of that stuff with us this afternoon. But not just me, because I've got a friend here too. Where's Jeff? Jeff Gray? Give him a big hand. Jeff, what is it particularly that you're going to be looking for? What could really excite you here today?
I think the most exciting thing will be to hear the stories that accompany the artefacts that families have brought in that explain the significance of them to the families themselves.
Yeah, and it's the home front, isn't it, just as much as the war front that we're interested in. Anyway, that's enough of us whittering on. I'll try and get out of this, and then let's get on with the show! Olay! Thank you for the present. Hello. Hi. High five, big hi, yeah! Hello. Nice to meet you, bud. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, sweetheart. Hiya. Now, you guys may have noticed that we've all got white gloves on. This is not because we're about to do magic, but because this document is so fragile and so important that we don't want it to be damaged by a gust of wind. Can you explain a bit about what it is?
It's a troop ship newspaper, Tony. And Graham here has brought it in. Perhaps you'd like to tell us the circumstances.
Well, it was stored away there amongst a whole lot of stuff at home, and it was decided there when I retired that we started to clear out as to what was actually there.
Yeah.
And we came across this, and then I noticed there that it was 1914.
Were there many of these kind of publications?
There were lots, Tony, as the war went on. This is interesting because it's a very early example. Most troop transports would produce newspapers of some sort. It was partly for entertainment, partly for information. It was also a safety valve that people could say things whimsically in print that they couldn't say to the chain of command, and so it was a way of letting off steam in what were often pretty brutal conditions.
It's a funny kind of paper, isn't it?
It's not paper, Tony.
What is it?
It's linen.
Why linen?
Well, the reason is that it's durable.
Yeah.
You could print maps on this sort of stuff and the linen would last, where in trench conditions and field conditions, paper very quickly tore. If you've ever seen a map from the First World War, it's usually creased, it's got tears and stains. This was designed to last a little bit longer under difficult conditions.
What did you think it was when you first saw it?
Well, when I first picked it up and being the material, we probably thought it was a bit of a tea towel until we had a closer look at it.
Oh, it's of far more value than a tea towel. It's a lovely find. Thank you for sharing it with me. All right, now, could you do me a favour? Yes, if you put your fingers there and yours on there. Sorry about all that fuss, it's just that that thing is so precious. You may have noticed that there's a rather severe-looking gentleman there in a red cap, and there is another severe-looking gentleman here in a red cap. What do those red caps signify? Military police. Military police. And why have we got military police here?
Because they're guarding a Victoria Cross.
They are indeed guarding a Victoria Cross. How much do you think a Victoria Cross is worth?
The last one, I think, was sold for about $1 million. $1
million? That was the last one. There you are. The one on the end is the Victoria Cross. You are looking at over $1 million. And who was awarded this Victoria Cross?
That was my father, Leslie Thomas Starcevich.
And what was his story?
He won it in Borneo at a place called Beaufort, and he was a Bren gunner. And his mate, Snowy, didn't come back, so he went looking for him and found him wounded. And he stood up and firing from the hip, he fired on some Japanese machine gun posts that were there, and he continued up the hill firing, and he took out 2 more.
Wow. And for that, he got the VC.
He did.
Terrific. And is this a photo of him?
Yes, that's a photo taken of him after the war. It's the only one I have when he's in civilian clothing.
It's a lovely looking photo, isn't it? Man who was awarded the Victoria Cross. And that's why you're being guarded by these 2 gentlemen. It's a great story, isn't it? You know, you don't have to wear those shades. It's only because you watch Reservoir Dogs, isn't it? He's smiling, he's smiling.
I'm at the Army Museum of Western Australia in Fremantle. This town promised us our biggest roadshow yet, but I don't think anything could have prepared me for the man I'm about to meet.
The reason that I asked you to gather around this little platform is because I want to talk to Mark now, Mark Donaldson, who's a little bit special because what's the medal that you won?
The Victoria Cross for Australia.
This is a Victoria Cross winner, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Let's go back to your childhood. Actually, you had quite a difficult childhood, didn't you?
Yeah, I was a bit rambunctious, I suppose, or naughty.
Yeah.
Probably the word for it. But yeah, definitely. Didn't like to play by the rules too much. Didn't listen to my parents too much.
So what happened to you then?
Well, I was in trouble a fair bit. Used to drink a lot when I was younger, actually. Yeah.
How old?
I was about 14, 15 at the time.
You
so,
bad boy.
Yeah. But when I was about 15, my dad died from a heart attack.
Oh.
So, you know, that was pretty hard to take.
But then you lost your mum as well,
that's
didn't you?
right.
How did you turn your life around after all that?
Well, you know, I was a slow learner. It took me a couple of years to figure it out, but, you know, I really decided there's too much in life to enjoy. I didn't want to waste it, either ending up in jail, through destructive behaviour or some sort of substance abuse, or or end up dead, and that wouldn't really honour the people that brought me into this world. And so I decided to choose another one, which led me into the Army in the Australian Special Air Service Regiment.
And you ended up in Afghanistan?
Yeah, found myself in Afghanistan, and since 2005 I'd been there every year between then and 2013. So,
Mark, we've talked about loads of people over the series who won the Victoria Cross, but of course Mark's the first person we've talked to who actually won the Victoria Cross. What does it mean to you to have won the VC?
For me, it's I guess it's a personal recognition, I suppose, from those guys that day who saw how I fought. And the only way you can get a VC is if 3 people witness the event, and then they recommend that goes up as some sort of award.
So there's bound to have been lots of other soldiers in other conflicts who did very heroic things, but actually there weren't sufficient witnesses around.
Yeah, that's right. All the witnesses might have died, or who knows. And I understand the importance of it as well, what it means to everyone else in Australia. And I learned that pretty soon after receiving the award, when a lady in the street came up to me in tears and gave me a hug and said, thanks very much for what you do. And again, that's not necessarily me, but it's what that award brings, And I try and, without losing who I am, I try and remember that as well. So.
Sure what they're doing here. Sorry to get in your way.
The militia.
I was trying to.
New South Wales. As soon as the war started, he enlisted and went to New Guinea.
Is this Wes?
It is indeed, Tony. Wes, we were talking about your great-grandfather, Sidney Goodsell. Would you like to tell us a little bit about his early experiences as a soldier?
Yeah, he was in the New South Wales militia prior to the war, and at the outbreak of war in 1914, he enlisted and went to New Guinea as part of the military expedition force that went up there and took Rabaul from the Germans.
So tell me about that particular action. How did that go?
It was basically designed to capture German radio stations, which were being used to control raiders that were operating in the Indian Ocean and right across the Pacific, and which, until they were eliminated, the Australian government was not happy about sending the first contingents of the AIF off to, as they thought, Britain and fighting on the Western Front.
Wes, the main reason that you've come to see us, though, is this, isn't it?
There's the marker flag, yeah.
This lovely marker flag. Where was it marking?
He was based in Courtney's Post, Gallipoli, and during the evacuation, he's obviously grabbed this.
What's Courtney's Post?
Courtney's was one of a succession of small forward fortified positions, Quinns, Steeles and Courtneys, which were generally regarded as amongst the most dangerous positions on the Anzac line, mainly because the Turkish trenches were only a matter of metres on the other side, so they were well within bombing distance. And there were some very, very fierce fights and a lot of very heavy casualties at different phases of the campaign.
Was he on Hill 60?
He was. He was freshly arrived from Egypt in late August, and they took the 18th Battalion up and attacked the Turkish lines, and they held them for a number of days and got pushed back and forth. Yeah.
And these are some of the medals that he won?
Yes, they were. They were the standard medals that the soldiers received, and the one on the end is the French Legion of Honour, also known as the Croix de Guerre.
I love that photo of him, don't you? It's a proper major. Dale has got this great story which involves this little suitcase.
Yeah, it's a bit of a treasure that we found when we were cleaning up in a family home, and discovered some stories that we'd heard about over the years of the family halfway house in North Fremantle during World War II.
Explain what you mean by you had the family halfway house.
My grandfather was a serviceman. He was a gunner in the artillery here at this barracks from 1912. And went right through until after World War II. During World War II, he ran the wet canteen on the other side of the parade ground here.
Yeah.
And he invited lots of the servicemen home. There were Dutch Navy and the Americans, of course, as well as all the Australian servicemen. And they knew that in North Fremantle they could, find a hot meal. And my dad was a very young, teenage boy, and his two older sisters were a bit of an attraction. And we, over the years, as grandchildren, heard the story of Vic. And Vic was a shore patrolman with the US Navy, here based in Fremantle. And when we were cleaning the house, we found a whole lot of stuff.
And what was this?
Well, it's a truncheon. I keep saying a nightstick, but it's a truncheon. He was a shore patrolman, so a policeman.
Yeah.
And his armband is there for the shore patrol.
And you've got the Jean Kelly hat.
And isn't it beautiful? Yeah, the hat.
And this photo,
lovely bit of my auntie Laurel.
Look at them, look at those two. Hot photo or what? But she didn't go back to America.
No, I think she wasn't brave enough. We found evidence that they'd made attempts about getting a passport and with the US Embassy, and I think in the end he went home in 1945. And this wonderful correspondence that went right through the years until the mid-90s when he passed away.
Did he get married?
They both married. Neither of them had any children.
Yeah.
But they kept up this wonderful friendship. And so when we found this little pile of goodies, that brought it home to us, the Vic story and where it had sprung from.
You know what interests me? She might have been a war bride.
She may have.
And it might have gone horribly wrong, as so many did.
Yes.
And yet they held on to that lovely romance and that lovely friendship. So maybe that was the best for both of them.
I think it was wonderful. We've all read the letters, my sisters and I, and looked at it, and there's a story in there. One day we'll tell it, maybe. But yes, a beautiful story.
Well, that's it, north, east, south, and now west. My tour of duty is over. And, even though we've done 10 cities in just about 12 weeks, I'd sign up for another tour of duty straight away. Why? Because I love the spirit in Australia and New Zealand. You're both young countries, but you're passionate about your history, and you're finding out more history, and you're making more history day by day. So thanks for your finds, thanks for your memorabilia. I think we've probably had more people here in Fremantle than in any other place, so give yourselves a big pat on the back. And that's the officers' mess, so see you in there, and I'll buy the first round. Yeah!